Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to walk you through the solution for the calculator layout challenge. So we know that this is what we're aiming for, right? This is what it should look like on portrait, and this is what it should look like in landscape. Notice a couple of things here. Firstly, we've got nicely stacked rows and columns, right? So it makes it a perfect opportunity to use the stack views that we've learned about. The other things are a couple of small details. Notice how between each of these buttons, there's a very small gap in between. So we're going to have to take into account of that when we create our layout. And finally, also notice how this 0 inside what seems to be a label is actually indented from the right. It's not glued to the right edge. There's a little bit of space there. So let's think about some of these things and try and lay out our interface. So of course we're going to go to our main.storyboard. And here you should see that I've already created essentially the user interface that you are aiming for. So this is very handy because it means that everything is already pretty much pixel perfect, whereas in reality you probably wouldn't get access to a file that's already been laid out for you. So you might end up with things that are a little bit more misplaced and, sized kind of differently. And it's your job to use these rules and these constraints to bring it together and make it look the way you want it to. So the first thing we notice about our user interface is that it's really regular. There's a lot of rows and a lot of columns. So let's start off by creating some stack views. So this seems like a natural stack, right? So if I'm holding down my command key and I'm selecting all 4 of these buttons, then I can simply go ahead and embed them into a stack view like this. And because they are roughly along the same horizontal line, they get embedded into this nice, neat little horizontal stack. Now, don't worry if at this point you see it's completely messed up the user interface. The point is not to keep it pixel perfect every step of the way, because as we change these rules and as we apply new constraints and new stack views, it's obviously going to evolve and change. All that matters is that the final thing looks like this. And in the process, we're going to be messing it up even more than this. So now that I've created one horizontal stack, it kind of seems to make sense that if I have one row here, one row here, one row here, row here, row here, row here. So I have 5 rows of buttons here. Now I'm going to go ahead and embed each of these rows into a stack view. And now you should end up with 5 stack views. We've got 5 horizontal stacks and this label at the very top. Now, if we go ahead and select each of the 5 stack views, as well as the label at the top, and drop all of these into a stack view, then it's going to create a vertical stack. Now, our interface is pretty much completely messed up, but that's not a problem. It's now laid out in roughly the relationship that we want. So all we have to do now is to add some constraints on top. Firstly, our vertical stack view, which contains all of the rows, is going to need to go to all the edges. So we're going to put 0, 0, 0, 0 so that it gets stretched and fits to the entire size of the screen. Now, the next thing to address is some of the properties of this stack view. So, for example, notice how at the moment the spacing is massive between each of these rows. It's like 81. Instead, we only want that small space that you see here, right? Which let's just call it 1 pixel and let's see how that looks. So let's go ahead and change the spacing to 1 pixel. And you can see that this part now looks pretty much like the outcome that we want. But for some reason, there's a big gap here between these top parts and the bottom parts. So how can we make it distributed more evenly? Well, you might remember that we can change the distribution of the stack so that it's filled equally, like so. And the alignment, instead of making it leading, so everything all squished up to the left, we can also change it to fill so that it fills the entire space that it's got access to, which is the entire width of the screen. Now, at the moment, if we look at each of these rows, they look a little bit messed up, right? So how can we make them look like the way that we saw in the README file, like this, evenly distributed and filled to take up the entire space? Well, we of course have to change some of the properties for each of these stack views. So let's start with the top one. And we're going to change the alignment from top to fill. And we're going to change the distribution to fill equally so that they take up an even amount of space along that horizontal row. So that's now looking pretty good, right? And if we want to apply the same things to the rest of the stack views, then all we have to do is select them by holding down Shift. And now we've got all 4 stack views, which we're going to change the alignment to fill and the distribution to fill equally. So we're getting pretty close to what we've got in the README file, right? So now the only one that looks pretty weird is this bottom one, because in the README file, in the example, we kind of had the 0 button taking up twice as much space as these two. So there are certain ways that you can set this. Well, the simplest way is actually to just embed these two into their own stack view. So now if we look at this bottom row, we have 2 items which are meant to fill equally. So this width and this width is meant to be equal. And then if we go into this second horizontal stack view and we make it also fill equally, then we get the effect that we want, which is where this 0 takes up as much space as these 2 buttons. And everything is now more or less aligned. Now, if you're noticing that on the iPhone 11 or the X series canvases and it's not going all the way down to the bottom, the reason for this is because for our main vertical stack view, we set the constraints so that they would go to all 4 edges. But remember that on the iPhone X series, there's actually a sort of home button of sorts here, where the user can swipe up so that they can go back to the home screen. So this area in black here is known as the safe area. But if you wanted the bottom of this stack view to go all the way to the edge, then you can double click on this and change that from safe area bottom to super view bottom, and change that constant to 0 so that there's no distance between them. And then you end up with this kind of effect. Now, it depends on you really, because usually it's not a good idea to put user interactive elements into the safe area, because it makes it really confusing when the user's trying to dismiss your app going to home, but instead they end up pressing on 0 or the dot. So I'm going to go ahead and select that constraint and change it back so that the stack view bottom is equal to the safe area bottom with 0 pixel distance, like this. And I'm going to show you how to address the next thing, which is, notice how R0 here is right up to the edge here. There's literally no distance between it and the right edge. But in the README file, you can see that there's clearly a big gap here, so it looks a little bit better. Now, how can we do this? Well, at the moment, we've got our label inside our stack view, and it is being asked to fill the entire width, right? That's what this alignment fill tells it to do. But if we wanted this to have a little bit of a gap, but none of these other rows to have a gap, then we have to embed this label into its own view. Now it's kind of inside a container. And let me just go ahead and make the background of this container see-through so that it doesn't actually affect our label. And then our label that's inside the view can then be asked to have some constraints. So for example, we could set the constraints so that it's 0 from the top, 0 from the bottom, and then 20 from the left and 20 from the right. And now if we add our constraints, you can see that we're now getting that little indentation there inside our stack view. And that's it. That's the solution to this challenge. If you struggled with this challenge, I recommend playing around with this interface, seeing if you can remove the stack views, create new stack views, maybe switch things around a bit, and just make it a few times and until you really understand what's going on here and what each of these settings and properties do. And just mess around with it. There's nothing that can really break. So change it up, change the alignment, change the distribution, change the axes, see what happens until you get a good grasp of how this works.